Do not get fooled by fancy finishes and appliances, as they could be masking a mess that could end up costing you thousands of dollars to repair. Buying a house that has been recently flipped might look like a dream come true. Shiny finishes, new appliances, everything looking pristine, but it can quickly turn into a nightmare
as more flippers get into the business.
A lot of times we'll see where there's termite damage or water damage in a house and it literally just gets slapstick, right over top of it. So it's literally doing lipstick on a pig.
Beneath that fresh paint and modern fixtures could be a mountain of hidden issues that could end up costing you thousands. In this video, we're going to talk about why you might regret buying a flip property and what you need to pay attention to so that you don't have buyer's remorse. Flippers are in the business of maximizing quantity, which in this case is time over quality. And that's because the longer they tie up in a project, not only are they spending more money, it's also costing them more money. And that's exactly why flippers are trying to get through projects as quickly as possible so that they can max out their bottom line. Now, something on that note, as a real estate agent who sees a lot of flip properties, not all flip properties are bad, but what I will say is the majority of them have a lot of issues. So you have to be very, very careful if you're considering buying a flipped home. The granite countertops, the new cabinets, the stainless steel appliances are meant to dazzle you. But remember, they could be hiding major problems underneath. Flippers are here to make a profit. So in many cases, looks comes before quality. And with that, I want to start with the most common issues that I see in flipped homes, along with what items you should pay attention to as a buyer, and lastly, what items I would personally focus on as a real estate agent for over 20 years if I were considering buying a flipped home. In my opinion, the most common trait I see when viewing flipped homes is poor workmanship. And what I mean by that is things you can just see with the naked eye. If you're paying attention to the details of these properties, a lot of times you can spot major issues. Things like uneven floors, poorly aligned cabinets, or in some cases just a misinstallation of appliances alone. In fact, the photos that I'm going to show here in just a minute are photos that I took at a property of a client of mine who was buying a recently flipped property. And what I will say is that if the visible work is subpar, imagine of all the things that you can't actually see. In these photos that you see here, you can see how the cabinets aren't aligned correctly. See the gap between the cabinet and the stove? And the reason that's there is because they improperly installed that cabinet. In fact, you can also see it along the crown molding here above the refrigerator. See that gap there? That shows you either one of two things: that the crown molding isn't installed correctly, or that the ceiling is uneven, which could be a bigger problem. In addition to that, you can see what a janky job they did when installing the tile. Even though it is under the refrigerator, they didn't properly install it. Instead of cutting a separate piece, they instead should have done an entirely new piece of tile there. On top of that, you can see how the dishwasher was installed, where the top of that dishwasher is supposed to be flush underneath the edge of the cabinet, but instead it's actually sticking out. And the reason for that is because they misinstalled the countertop. Now, with this particular property, we could go on and on about the different things they did wrong in this property, like ignoring that the foundation was actually sinking on this home, where you can see that the floor here is completely uneven. And if you don't believe me, you can see here how the chimney on the back of the house is actually pulling away, which they tried to mask by spraying some expandifoam in there. Now, in the case of this property, there were actually additional issues that I don't have photos for, but fortunately for my client, he took my advice and decided to move on to another property rather than deal with the potential liability of this home. Now, speaking of liabilities, the second thing that I see the most common when looking at flip properties is unpermitted work being completed. Not only is it potentially unsafe, but it could also impact your resale value as well as any insurance claims that you might have on that property down the road. Now, in some cases, when buying flip property and permits aren't pulled, it's not really a big deal, especially if it's minor issues where maybe an electrical outlet's changed out or maybe light fixtures were changed out. But at the end of the day, all of that stuff should actually be permitted. But here's where I think it's a bigger issue, and that's when they start removing walls, especially load-bearing walls. And this is because in some cases, that load-bearing wall is actually supporting a second level. And a lot of times this is really obvious when you have a completely open floor plan. So just be very careful if you're buying a property where they don't have the proper permits pulled, because just because it's not an issue now doesn't mean it's not going to be one in the future. Now, the third thing I see a lot of in flipped homes is using cheap labor in order to cut costs. And a lot of times using cheap labor means you're using unlicensed professionals to do that work. Now, as somebody who's owned quite a few homes, bought and sold property, done a lot of work on different properties, I've personally used unlicensed people to do work. But here's the thing, I found people that were really, really good at their craft and did things in a workmanlike manner. But with that, you have to be very, very careful when buying these properties to make sure they were actually done by people that were licensed, especially if they didn't get the work permitted. Now, if it was permitted by the city and they used unlicensed workers, that's one thing. But if they have no permits and the workers were unlicensed, you could be setting yourself up for a costly repair down the road. Now, the last thing I see a lot of that I want to talk about before we talk about what you should be paying attention to is that flippers ignore a lot of the hidden areas. They pay a lot of attention to the visible areas, what you can actually see with the naked eye. Where they're not paying a lot of attention to is underneath the house, in the attic, potentially on the roof. And this is where a lot of issues often lie, and that's because they're not as obvious. So what can you do as a buyer who's buying a flipped home do to protect yourself through this process? Well, the very first thing I would try to do is confirm that permits were actually pulled for the work that was completed on that home. And with that, you want to make sure all the major renovations, any electrical, any plumbing, and especially structural, have proper permit. If there's no permit at all, that could be a red flag that the work might actually be subpar and could end up costing you issues down the line. The second thing you can do is demand full disclosures. Ask them for the disclosures from when they actually purchased the property. So when you buy a property, one thing the seller is required to do is give you disclosures that they're required to fill out when selling that home. Now, one thing about an investor is because they don't really know anything about the property, because they haven't lived in the property, there in turn isn't a lot to disclose. But in some cases, if you can get the disclosures from the previous seller, there might be something in there that could cause you to dig a little bit deeper on some of this stuff. Because remember, painting and flooring are two things on a property that can really improve the visibility of that property. But also, they're the same two things that could be done on a home that could hide potential issues of that property. If the previous homeowner had a water leak or had mold or something in a wall or cracks or whatever, all the new seller has to do is paint over those for them to not be visible when you're buying that home. So with that, get a full scope of what the investor did when they decided to flip that home. I believe it's as of January of 2024. If you're buying a flipped home, you can request all the receipts of the work that was completed on that home. At least that's the way it works here in California. So if you're buying a flip property, ask them for receipts. Ask them for who did the work. Because if a flipper is reluctant to provide this, it might mean that they didn't do it correctly, that they used unlicensed people, or in some cases cut corners where it might actually matter most. Now, the next thing you can do, and probably the most important out of everything I'm talking about here, is get a full inspection of the property, both inside and outside. Please do not skip on inspections, even if everything looks new. And with that, you want to make sure that your inspector checks every nook and cranny. That means the attic. That means the crawl space if there is one. In addition to that, you might want to get additional inspections like termite inspections, mold inspections, sewer inspections, or in some cases, maybe even an asbestos inspection. Because typically speaking, a general inspector doesn't go into depth on a lot of these different things. You need a specialized person to catch some of these things that your normal home inspector might not catch. The one thing you'll often hear me say is people buy emotionally and they justify logically. And when it comes to a new home, people get very, very emotional. They defend the property. Remember, we all have biases, and when somebody is buying a home, they're emotionally attached to that property. So little issues present themselves, it's not really a big deal. Something bigger comes up, they start to defend it. As I mentioned earlier, new paint and flooring can make a home look really, really fresh. But at the same time, they can also be masking things like water stains, mold, pet odors, or in the case of the home that I mentioned earlier, uneven floors. So don't let the newness, the prettiness of a property keep you from actually digging a little bit deeper. Now, one of the questions I often get is, hey Jeb, what would you focus on if you were buying a home? Well, as an agent for over 20 years, I would focus on high ticket items that cost me a lot of money to repair or replace. Now, oftentimes when you're buying a flipped home or a new property, a lot of these items should have been replaced. But what you'll often see, as I mentioned earlier, is these flippers focus on the things that you can see, things like the appliances, the flooring, the paint, all the visible stuff, the cosmetic stuff. But a lot of times that's not where the expense really lies. So in the case of me buying a home, I look at things like the heating and air conditioning, the HVAC, in addition to the water heater, the electrical panel, the appliances, the plumbing, as well as the roof and chimney, because these are all items that are very, very expensive to replace and or repair in many cases. So in the case that you're buying a light new property and they're asking a high ticket ticket price for that property because it looks new, just make sure you're getting exactly what you're paying for. Because if any of these items are old or improperly installed, replacing them could easily blow your budget. Buying a flipped house can be a great opportunity, but only if you're aware of the risk and know exactly what to look for. Have you looked at flipped properties, or did you purchase one? Have you come across any issues? Let me know in the comments below. Don't get blindsided by shiny finishes and new appliances. Do your due diligence, dig deep, and protect your investment.